What is the Neville Goddard Method to multiply your income? And why does it hold the power to transform not just your finances, but the way you see reality itself? This is where the revelation begins. Because in this video, you will discover how your imagination is not fantasy, but the unseen engine that multiplies money, magnetizes opportunities, and shapes every financial outcome you've ever experienced. This is where it's revealed that Neville's method isn't about effort or chance, but about assumption, feeling, and inner conviction that rearrange the world outside to mirror the world within. This is where you learn that wealth has never been about hard work, but about the state of consciousness from which all results are born. This is where it's made clear that multiplying your income begins the moment you stop trying to earn more and start assuming more. This is where you'll see why Neville said imagination creates reality, and how that truth operates through the very thoughts and emotions that rule your financial life. This is where it unfolds. The understanding that your bank account is a reflection of your inner conversations about worth, possibility, and abundance. This is where the turning point arrives, when you realize that the voice inside saying, "I can't afford it," is not describing life, but designing it. This is where truth breaks through, when you understand that every assumption held with feeling becomes a command to the invisible power that governs form and fortune. This is where illusion fades, when you stop believing in lack as external and start seeing it as self-created imagery ready to be rewritten. This is why it matters, because every act of imagination is a seed, and every seed is destined to grow in the soil of belief. This is how it deepens, as you grasp that multiplying income is not the accumulation of numbers, but the multiplication of inner certainty. This is where the light enters, when you realize that what you feel real now must appear in time and space exactly as you have assumed it. This is where faith becomes function, when you stop looking to effort and start living from the unseen cause within. This is where creation happens. In the quiet moment, you dare to feel yourself rich before the evidence arrives. This is where energy shifts, from striving to assuming, from hoping to knowing. This is where your power returns, because imagination obeys its own law, and that law never fails when understood. This is where possibility awakens, in the realization that you were never chasing money, you were chasing your own forgotten power. This is where the entire journey begins. A journey through Neville's timeless teachings that will show you, step by step, how to multiply your income by mastering the art of inner assumption. This is where you stand at the threshold, not of learning something new, but of remembering who you truly are, the imaginer of wealth itself. Can you imagine discovering that the only difference between someone who multiplies their income effortlessly and someone who struggles endlessly lies not in opportunity, but in assumption? This is where the veil lifts, revealing Neville Goddard's most profound law, the law of assumption, the silent architect behind every fortune and every failure. This is where the journey deepens, showing that what you assume as true in your imagination compels the world to make it so. This is where truth gains form, because to assume wealth with feeling is to set in motion an invisible order that reconfigures events, people, and timing in your favor. This is where realization dawns, that believing you are already rich internally forces life to echo that conviction externally. This is where the mystery unfolds, that the universe is not responding to what you want, but to what you are in consciousness. This is where transformation begins, when the words "I am wealthy" cease to be an affirmation and become your living identity. This is where reality bends, when your inner acceptance of prosperity manifests as clients, promotions, ideas, or coincidences that multiply income without strain. This is where you see why Neville insisted that assumption, not action, is the seed of manifestation. This is where the old paradigm cracks. The belief that you must do more, work harder, or chase results begins to crumble under the truth of effortless creation. This is where your new paradigm forms, when you realize the real work is inner alignment, not outer struggle. This is where feeling replaces force, and your income begins to mirror your emotional certainty rather than your physical effort. This is where subtle mastery emerges, when you learn to hold the feeling of financial fulfillment until the world cannot help but conform. This is where resistance dissolves, because assumption bypasses doubt and directs reality to obey belief. This is where clarity strikes, that to assume is not to pretend, but to occupy the state of being that makes your desired outcome inevitable. This is where unseen laws respond, rearranging conditions and people in ways that appear miraculous but are, in truth, logical expressions of your inner stance. This is where you feel the shift, the calm confidence that replaces fear when you know your income is multiplied the moment you assume it so. This is where magic feels natural, because you are no longer trying to attract wealth. You are living from wealth. This is where mastery begins to take root, the point at which assumption becomes your second nature and money becomes an effortless reflection of your inner certainty. This is where the world changes, because you have changed your state, and the outer must obey the inner command that you now fully embody. Picture for a moment living as if your desired wealth were already yours, moving through each day with the composure, confidence, and ease of someone whose financial dreams have already come true. This is where Neville Goddard's principle of living from the end transforms from philosophy into practical power, showing you how to inhabit the result before it appears. This is where the inner movie begins, not of you chasing money, but of you already being the person who has multiplied it effortlessly. This is where the subtle difference reveals itself, because imagining from the wish fulfilled is not the same as imagining of it. This is where the magic lies, in the unseen feeling that convinces the subconscious mind that the result already exists. This is where creation solidifies, because once the mind accepts a scene as real, the outer world must organize itself to match it. This is where you learn that wealth is not something to reach for, but something to remember. This is where illusion falls away, because you no longer pray to receive, but act as though the receiving has already happened. This is where you experience freedom, when your emotions stop fluctuating with circumstances and start flowing from your chosen inner reality. This is where truth becomes tactile. You taste, touch, and breathe your financial abundance inwardly until it becomes undeniable outwardly. This is where the turning point emerges, the moment you stop seeking signs and begin generating them through sustained inner conviction. This is where identity fuses with destiny, when you realize that to live from the end is to live as the cause of all effects. This is where your assumptions begin to crystallize into opportunities that seem to appear out of nowhere. This is where ordinary effort transforms into effortless unfolding, as your outer world dances to the rhythm of your inner certainty. This is where the mind's power expands, learning that every thought, word, and emotion must now serve the state you have chosen. This is where your days begin to change subtly. New ideas, helpful people, and perfect timing start to move in harmony with your new self-image. This is where patience transforms into quiet confidence, because you no longer wait for proof, you walk in proof. This is where your imagination becomes the only currency that matters, shaping transactions, invitations, and opportunities alike. This is where the promise of Neville's teaching fulfills itself, that if you live from the end will live through you. This is where the principle becomes personal. You are no longer imagining success, you are being it. Now consider this. What if every word you whisper to yourself in silence becomes the blueprint of your financial future? This is where the invisible dialogue within you begins to speak louder than any outer effort could. This is where Neville's insight cuts deep. Your inner conversations are not private thoughts, but creative commands to the subconscious mind. This is where the unseen becomes the architect of the scene. Every assumption, every silent statement builds the financial reality you walk through. This is where the magic of awareness awakens, when you realize that every time you say, "I can't afford that," you are instructing life to agree. This is where power returns to you, because the moment you change your inner speech, your outer results must shift to match the new pattern. This is where wealth begins to gather momentum, when your thoughts become inner affirmations of capability, worth, and expansion. This is where the turning point emerges, when your mind stops being an echo of lack and starts being the voice of abundance. This is where truth reveals itself, that you don't have to speak wealth out loud, you have to feel it quietly within. This is where consciousness takes command. The self you talk to in imagination is the one creating your world of income and opportunity. This is where the deeper understanding dawns. That faith is not blind belief, but the inner conversation sustained without contradiction. This is where resistance weakens, because you begin to notice and rewrite the subtle thoughts that once kept prosperity at bay. This is where intention becomes intimacy. You start to speak to yourself as though your desires have already been fulfilled. This is where the unseen becomes obedient. Money, people, and ideas begin to respond to your new tone of thought. This is where energy reorganizes itself, when your inner language matches your desired outcome with unwavering consistency. This is where the miracle feels ordinary, because reality simply mirrors what you've been telling yourself all along. This is where creative authority awakens. You recognize that no outside condition has ever been greater than your inner dialogue. This is where mastery takes form. You hold inner conversations of wealth until they feel more real than doubt. This is where you begin to speak the language of the infinite, and the infinite responds, multiplying your income through channels you could never plan. This is where you finally understand your words within are not idle, they are wealth in the making. Suppose you discover that every financial setback you've ever faced still lives inside you, quietly replaying its defeat until you rewrite it with imagination. This is where Neville Goddard's technique of revision becomes the secret key to freedom from the past that keeps shaping your present income. This is where the veil of guilt, regret, and frustration begins to dissolve, because you now understand that the past is not fixed, it's flexible, waiting for your conscious correction. This is where the story shifts, as you realize every lost deal, every denied opportunity, every mistake with money can be revised and transformed into a victory of understanding. This is where creation turns backward in time, healing, not through logic, but through reimagined experience. This is where the turning point arises. You no longer analyze your financial failures, you recreate them in your mind as successes. This is where truth deepens. You are not bound by memory, but liberated by imagination's ability to rewrite it. This is where cause and effect blur, because once the subconscious accepts your revised story, the outer world aligns to match it as though it always had. This is where illusion collapses, when you see that time itself bends to belief. This is where you start practicing nightly revision, going back over the day and reshaping each financial disappointment into triumph. This is where emotional alchemy takes place. Bitterness turns to gratitude, loss turns to insight, and frustration turns to creative flow. This is where you begin to understand that money isn't lost, it's redirected by the energy of your dominant assumption. This is where your power expands, because you no longer fear mistakes, you redeem them. This is where peace replaces panic, when you realize no experience has final authority over you unless you continue to imagine it as true. This is where the subconscious obeys your new version, rewriting your identity as someone who always lands on their feet. This is where new opportunities start to appear, because you've stopped looping failure and started scripting fortune. This is where your mind learns flexibility, turning any no into a future yes, through the power of revision. This is where the creative principle reveals its mercy, that nothing is ever truly lost when imagination is used correctly. This is where you awaken to a profound realization. The past doesn't define your income, your revised story does. This is where you stand taller, no longer haunted by what was, but inspired by what you can now rewrite into being. Envision a world where every emotion you hold becomes the substance of your financial experience, where the secret to multiplying income is not thought, effort, or chance, but feeling. This is where Neville's timeless principle comes alive, revealing that emotion is not a byproduct of life, but the creative force that shapes it. This is where the heart becomes the workshop of the divine, translating unseen assumptions into tangible riches. This is where truth rises to the surface. Whatever you feel as real persists until it manifests. This is where the game of wealth changes, because now you understand that the feeling of abundance must precede the evidence of it. This is where you stop waiting for money to make you feel secure, and instead use the feeling of security to make money appear. This is where your emotional state becomes your greatest investment, compounding quietly in the realm of imagination. This is where consciousness expands. You no longer chase results. You cultivate the vibration that commands them. This is where awareness sharpens, teaching you that emotion and belief are partners in the creation of wealth. This is where self-mastery takes shape, when you learn to choose your emotional reality before the physical one gives you a reason. This is where old conditioning loses power, because the mind that feels poor can no longer survive in the heart that feels rich. This is where the alchemy of feeling begins, turning doubt into certainty, frustration into fulfillment, and fear into freedom. This is where energy synchronizes, the external world rearranging itself to mirror the inner frequency of abundance you've sustained. This is where the turning point ignites, when feeling ceases to be reactive and becomes directive. This is where miracles feel inevitable, because the world simply reflects the emotions you've decided to inhabit. This is where wealth stops being a pursuit and becomes a state of being, constantly mirrored in opportunity, connection, and flow. This is where you understand why Neville said feeling is the secret. It bypasses logic, it bypasses resistance, it becomes creation itself. This is where the invisible becomes visible, the emotional becomes material, and your imagined wealth becomes embodied truth. This is where fulfillment begins long before the payment clears, and by the time it does, you are already rich within. This is where mastery lives, in the ability to feel now what others wait to feel later, knowing that the world must eventually conform to the vibration you have chosen. Think of the moment when you realize that your imagination is not daydreaming, but deliberate design, that every inner scene you construct is a living blueprint awaiting expression. This is where Neville Goddard's technique of mental imagery becomes the most potent tool in your wealth creation arsenal. This is where imagination turns from abstract to active, as you begin to craft inner movies that portray your desired financial life in vivid sensory detail. This is where creative consciousness reveals its structure. Every imagined act, if felt real, becomes a cause set in motion. This is where your scenes become the soil in which new realities germinate. This is where the magic of participation unfolds. You no longer watch your imagination. You enter it, experiencing your wealth as though it's already happening. This is where truth gains muscle, because the subconscious cannot distinguish between imagination and actual experience. This is where consistency becomes your secret weapon, rehearsing your financial fulfillment nightly until it becomes your inner normal. This is where old limitations fade, replaced by the felt reality of success rehearsed so vividly that the world must catch up. This is where cause and effect merge. You no longer wait for proof. You script the proof inside your mind. This is where the mind becomes cinema, the soul becomes director, and your feeling becomes the projection light of creation. This is where every imagined handshake, bank message, or congratulatory call builds an energetic pathway toward its physical counterpart. This is where you learn that the key is not to watch from afar, but to feel within, to smell the new car, to sense the satisfaction of abundance, to hear the laughter of financial relief. This is where the turning point unfolds, when you move from mental effort to immersive experience. This is where resistance dissolves, for the imagination that feels real enough no longer asks for permission to manifest. This is where time collapses, because the moment you live the scene internally, the outcome is already secured. This is where awareness matures. You understand that creation doesn't require evidence. It requires emotional participation. This is where the unseen world begins to coordinate coincidences, opportunities, and meetings that mirror your imagined movie. This is where mastery deepens. You stop hoping for wealth and start rehearsing it into being. This is where you realize your imagination is not fantasy. It is the only true factory of your financial reality. Ask yourself what happens when you finally see that success is never random, that every raise, every promotion, and every unexpected opportunity is governed by an invisible inner law, responding to your state of consciousness. This is where Neville's principle takes shape in the world of work and money, showing you that your income is not controlled by bosses, economies, or circumstances, but by the mood you live from each day. This is where the illusion of hierarchy fades, because you begin to see that positions of power and influence rise to meet the vibration of your inner assumption. This is where you stop chasing validation and start assuming recognition, knowing that the world must mirror the belief you hold about your worth. This is where unseen alignment begins, your energy quietly radiating competence, certainty, and value long before the title arrives. This is where the law starts working for you, translating inner confidence into outer advancement. This is where the turning point forms, when you cease asking, "When will I get promoted?" and begin declaring within, "I already am that person." This is where awareness expands. You understand that no manager or institution can withhold what consciousness has already claimed. This is where your behavior shifts effortlessly, because assumption changes posture, tone, and presence, without the strain of forced confidence. This is where your energy begins to speak louder than your words. Doors open because they recognize the authority of your inner stance. This is where the old belief in competition dissolves, replaced by cooperation with universal law. This is where you learn that no external decision determines your destiny, only your sustained inner assumption does. This is where creative momentum builds. The more you assume success, the more success assumes you. This is where opportunities seem to chase you, as life organizes itself around the energy of your conviction. This is where doubt loses ground, because the invisible law rewards faith in yourself as the ultimate currency. This is where every act of confidence becomes an invocation, a magnetic field drawing recognition and reward. This is where patience feels powerful, for you know the outcome is already guaranteed by the state you occupy. This is where gratitude anchors your awareness. You celebrate the unseen promotion that has already begun in consciousness. This is where the miracle of ordinary life unfolds. You find that the invisible law is not mystical but mathematical. Assume wealth, and wealth responds. This is where you finally realize that every advancement was never given to you. It was drawn to you by who you dared to become within. Consider the possibility that every dollar you desire already exists, waiting only for your consciousness to claim it and transform it into reality. This is where Neville Goddard's method illuminates the blueprint behind financial manifestation, showing you that desire alone is never enough. What matters is how you live in the state of the fulfilled desire. This is where imagination becomes the drafting table of your wealth, where each scene, feeling, and assumption sketches the contours of your future income. This is where ordinary longing evolves into deliberate creation, because you no longer merely want money, you feel yourself as the possessor of it. This is where the turning point appears, when your inner life becomes the cause and external events obediently follow. This is where every thought is charged with purpose, each emotion a spark igniting the blueprint into existence. This is where doubt begins to dissolve, because the act of assuming reality internally leaves no room for uncertainty to persist. This is where the subtle art of focus emerges, directing your mind away from lack and toward the complete, living picture of financial fulfillment. This is where the outer world bends to the inner command. Clients, deals, or income streams manifest naturally as extensions of your assumed state. This is where clarity sharpens, revealing that the timing, method, and source of money are secondary. The state of being is primary. This is where persistence becomes effortless, because feeling rich internally sustains momentum without conscious struggle. This is where creativity floods your life. Solutions, opportunities, and ideas arise spontaneously as manifestations of your inner blueprint. This is where resistance melts. No circumstance can contradict the identity you have assumed. This is where patience transforms into certainty. You wait not with anxiety but with confidence that reality must reflect your inner script. This is where imagination becomes tangible. Scenes imagined with sensory richness begin to echo in the physical world. This is where the hidden law reveals itself. Money, opportunity, and success always answer the state from which you act, not the superficial requests you make. This is where empowerment crystallizes. You realize that to shape desire into reality is simply to live as if it is already done. This is where the internal becomes external. The blueprint of wealth impressed in your mind radiates outward and organizes life to match. This is where your identity and your income merge. The person you imagine yourself to be determines the financial life you inhabit. This is where mastery begins, because the blueprint, once fully assumed, cannot fail, and every desire left in the hands of imagination is destined to unfold. Now consider this. The difference between wishing for wealth and truly possessing it lies entirely in faith, the invisible current that carries your assumptions into reality. This is where Neville Goddard's teaching becomes luminous. Faith is not belief in evidence, but unwavering trust in the unseen, a certainty that what you imagine must materialize. This is where the transformation begins, when you allow faith to replace doubt, knowing that your inner conviction is the engine behind all income multiplication. This is where subtle power awakens, because faith aligns every thought, emotion, and action with the reality you intend to experience. This is where the turning point emerges, when you stop negotiating with circumstances and begin commanding them through your inner certainty. This is where your imagination becomes a living force, for faith energizes it until the unseen blueprint of your wealth becomes inevitable. This is where persistence strengthens, because the more you trust, the less outer events can disturb you. This is where miracles feel natural, as opportunities, ideas, and synchronicities begin appearing in ways that seem coincidental, but are actually orchestrated by your unwavering faith. This is where inner authority takes root. You no longer rely on luck or timing. You rely on the law that what is assumed as real must manifest. This is where resistance dissolves, because faith eliminates the contradiction between what you want and what you believe is possible. This is where your energy radiates magnetism, drawing wealth and opportunity toward you effortlessly. This is where awareness sharpens. You notice subtle signs and nudges that confirm your inner state is already producing results. This is where emotional alignment becomes essential, because feelings of certainty, gratitude, and abundance fuel the creative process more than any action ever could. This is where every imagined scene of financial success gains gravity, bending circumstances to match your inner reality. This is where you start living in anticipation rather than desperation, experiencing the results before they appear. This is where your subconscious begins to obey, carrying forward your assumptions as unshakable truths. This is where clarity emerges. You see that outer circumstances are never the source of wealth. Consciousness is. This is where creative freedom expands, allowing you to innovate, attract, and receive without fear or strain. This is where the invisible law proves its authority. Faith is the signal, and income is the response. This is where you finally understand Neville's promise, that mastery of faith in imagination is mastery of wealth itself. Envision a life where your desires no longer grip you with tension, where wanting is replaced by a serene knowing, and the very act of needing money does not disturb your inner peace. This is where Neville Goddard teaches that detachment is the overlooked secret in multiplying income, the invisible step that transforms effort into effortless manifestation. This is where the paradox becomes clear. Holding the desire lightly while feeling it fully realized is the way to allow it to flow into your life. This is where resistance begins to dissolve, because clinging to outcome creates friction, while detachment opens the path for the unseen to operate freely. This is where your inner state becomes the true magnet, attracting wealth without force or struggle. This is where the turning point emerges. You stop measuring your reality against outer evidence and begin living from the assumed end of financial abundance. This is where the law of life aligns. When you no longer chase results, you allow circumstances to orchestrate themselves in perfect timing. This is where patience becomes power, as detachment grants space for opportunity, synchronicity, and inspired action to converge. This is where inner mastery reveals itself. You cultivate desire with intensity, but release it with grace. This is where the subtle shift occurs, changing anxiety into confident expectation, doubt into quiet certainty. This is where faith deepens, because letting go proves that the outcome is already secured within your imagination. This is where your energy radiates balance, drawing opportunities that resonate with your inner calm. This is where the unseen law operates without obstruction. The universe moves swiftly to fulfill desires unburdened by tension. This is where persistence becomes effortless, sustained not by effort, but by steady, confident alignment. This is where external circumstances begin to reflect your internal serenity, and wealth manifests as a natural extension of your state. This is where focus sharpens. You pursue opportunities not out of desperation, but from inspired choice. This is where the mind learns to trust, and the heart learns to wait, knowing creation unfolds in its perfect time. This is where alignment becomes your currency. The more detached you are, the freer money flows. This is where miracles seem inevitable, as income streams multiply without strain or struggle. This is where the final realization dawns. Detachment does not mean indifference. It is the quiet mastery that allows imagination and faith to work unhindered, producing abundance beyond expectation. Picture for a moment the hours you spend asleep as the most powerful stage for creating your financial reality, where your conscious mind rests but your subconscious works tirelessly to manifest your desires. This is where Neville Goddard's state akin to sleep becomes your secret laboratory for multiplying income, the liminal space where imagination impresses itself on the subconscious without resistance. This is where the turning point emerges, because the mind in this state is highly suggestible, accepting assumptions as absolute truth, regardless of prior doubts. This is where the technique unfolds. You vividly imagine financial success just before drifting into sleep, feeling every detail as if it is happening in this very moment. This is where reality begins to rearrange. The subconscious begins orchestrating circumstances, people, and opportunities to align with the scene impressed in slumber. This is where unseen forces act, working silently to bridge imagination with manifestation while you rest. This is where mastery of timing takes shape, as repeated nightly practice cements the inner state that produces wealth. This is where doubt weakens, because the subconscious no longer differentiates between imagined and experienced events during this heightened receptive state. This is where energy redirects effortlessly, flowing toward the projects, investments, and encounters that match your inner assumption. This is where your inner dialogue becomes your ally, crafting a scenario of abundance with sensory richness, visual, auditory, and emotional detail intensifying belief. This is where momentum builds, because each night you impress a new scene, reinforcing the certainty of your financial growth. This is where the turning point sharpens. The day begins under the influence of the imagined state, guiding choices and attracting opportunity naturally. This is where old habits of scarcity lose grip, replaced by subconscious alignment with abundance. This is where trust deepens, knowing that sleep is not idle, but the stage for your inner power to operate unhindered. This is where miracles appear ordinary as timely connections and unexpected solutions emerge with consistency. This is where imagination becomes your chief architect, and sleep becomes the vehicle through which it communicates with reality. This is where the boundary between waking creation and dreaming dissolves. Your desires take root invisibly, yet irreversibly. This is where financial growth accelerates, not by effort, but by the repeated rehearsal of wealth as already accomplished. This is where the principle crystallizes. The state akin to sleep is a sacred conduit for impressing your subconscious with the inevitability of multiplied income. This is where your mastery awakens, transforming every night into a creative act that builds the life you assume into being. Envision a world where the person you imagine yourself to be holds far more influence over your income than any external circumstance, where your identity becomes the silent magnet attracting wealth. This is where Neville Goddard's principle of assuming the end fully illuminates the path to financial expansion, teaching that who you are internally dictates what you receive externally. This is where the turning point emerges, because when your self-concept shifts to that of a wealthy, capable individual, the world has no choice but to respond in kind. This is where imagination fuses with identity, creating a living, breathing version of yourself that already inhabits financial freedom. This is where old limitations dissolve, as you cease identifying with scarcity, struggle, or lack. This is where the law begins to operate without interference. The outer world mirrors the inner person with uncanny precision. This is where your posture, speech, and choices change subtly, reflecting the new identity and reinforcing it in every interaction. This is where confidence becomes magnetic, attracting opportunities, collaborations, and clients that resonate with the person you have become. This is where resistance weakens. Because you are no longer trying to earn approval or wealth, you embody it inherently. This is where persistence becomes effortless, sustained by the natural consistency of living as the fulfilled version of yourself. This is where creative energy aligns and ideas begin flowing in perfect harmony with your inner state. This is where timing bends to your favor, as events, promotions, and unexpected income appear when they are needed most. This is where clarity sharpens. You see that money flows to identity, not effort, and your internal transformation precedes every material gain. This is where the invisible law demonstrates precision, responding to the reality you assume with absolute fidelity. This is where faith deepens, as living the identity of abundance generates certainty beyond reasoning. This is where your relationships shift, drawing people who recognize, respect, and respond to your new frequency. This is where your daily choices become effortless, guided by alignment with the assumed self rather than by external pressure. This is where the turning point solidifies. The external world can no longer contradict the internal truth you have embraced. This is where mastery manifests, because when identity governs, wealth follows automatically. This is where you finally understand that to multiply income, you must first multiply the self from which it flows. Can you imagine a life where every thought of lack dissolves into a vivid inner vision of abundance, where scarcity no longer dictates your financial reality but becomes a canvas for imagination? This is where Neville Goddard's teaching guides you to recognize that scarcity is not external. It is a mental state ready to be rewritten with deliberate, imaginative effort. This is where the turning point arrives, when you shift from noticing what is missing to imagining what is fully present, feeling it with the intensity of reality. This is where transformation unfolds, because the subconscious accepts only what is presented as real, and your mental creation reshapes perception into material form. This is where limitations vanish. The mind no longer accepts smallness as default, and new possibilities surge into awareness. This is where the invisible law begins to operate. Every imaginative act of abundance sends ripples into circumstances, aligning events with your assumed prosperity. This is where freedom emerges, as you no longer respond to fear of lack, but instead direct your energy toward fertile visions of wealth. This is where emotional alignment becomes essential. Desire alone is weak, but desire married to feeling produces irresistible creative force. This is where the turning point sharpens. Your inner scenes replace worry, visualizations become habitual, and scarcity thinking loses all power over your experience. This is where subtle mastery develops. You begin to catch fleeting doubts and immediately replace them with richly imagined outcomes of success. This is where the mind begins to operate as a magnetic field, drawing people, money, and opportunities into harmony with your inner state. This is where old patterns of limitation crumble, for imagination insists on obeying the reality you now claim. This is where confidence accelerates, as daily practice of abundant visualization rewires your expectations. This is where the unseen law reveals precision. Once scarcity is no longer assumed, the world cannot enforce it externally. This is where opportunity surfaces naturally, because your inner state signals readiness and receptivity. This is where patience transforms into anticipation, as you trust the process while imagining fulfillment with certainty. This is where the energy of wealth becomes habitual, coloring every decision, interaction, and choice. This is where the turning point solidifies. Abundance becomes the lens through which every circumstance is interpreted. This is where mastery deepens, because imagination is no longer idle. It is the engine of continuous creation. This is where you understand that overcoming scarcity is not about earning more, but about living more richly within first, allowing the outer world to align effortlessly. Think of the moment when you realize that money is not an independent force, but a reflection of the state of consciousness you inhabit, a shadow cast by the beliefs, assumptions, and feelings within. This is where Neville Goddard's insight reveals that financial circumstances never lead, they follow, always mirroring your inner world. This is where the turning point emerges, when you stop blaming external conditions and start mastering the state of mind that produces them. This is where clarity sharpens, showing that wealth is not something to pursue, but something to reflect. a shadow of your own consciousness made tangible. This is where transformation begins, as you shift focus from income to identity, from effort to assumption, from fear to inner certainty. This is where the unseen law operates silently, translating internal conviction into external manifestation. This is where your imagination becomes a laboratory, testing the inner conditions that will inevitably produce desired results. This is where resistance dissolves, because outer events can no longer dictate your sense of security or abundance. This is where subtle mastery develops. You begin to observe every thought and feeling as a determinant of financial outcomes. This is where patience becomes creative force, for the shadow must align with the source before it appears fully. This is where momentum builds, as consistent inner assumptions accelerate opportunities, ideas, and income streams. This is where you recognize that money is obedient, not random, always responding to the identity you carry within. This is where faith deepens, because control is internalized, and circumstances are understood as reflections, not arbiters of wealth. This is where energy harmonizes with intent, producing effortless coordination between imagination and reality. This is where ordinary events transform into evidence of alignment, as your inner state commands attention without effort. This is where your consciousness becomes the true currency, and all financial measures become its reflection. This is where the turning point crystallizes. Outer money cannot exist without first being conceived, assumed, and felt within. This is where mastery emerges. You are no longer chasing wealth. You are holding the state that naturally produces it. This is where the invisible law demonstrates precision. Money mirrors exactly the consciousness that gave it shape. This is where you finally understand that to multiply income, you must first multiply the inner reality from which it shadows forth. Picture, for a moment, stepping into a life where abundance surrounds you, not as scattered occurrences, but as a continuous atmosphere shaped by your inner state, a field in which every financial opportunity naturally takes form. This is where Neville Goddard's teaching on living in the feeling of the end shows that wealth is not isolated events. It is a pervasive environment created within consciousness. This is where the turning point emerges, when you stop reacting to isolated gains or losses and begin cultivating an ongoing internal climate of prosperity. This is where the unseen begins to operate systematically, as every thought, feeling, and assumption contributes to the rich tapestry of your outer life. This is where ordinary interactions become charged with possibility, because the atmosphere you inhabit signals readiness to the universe. This is where your imagination acts as the architect, constructing scenarios, decisions, and opportunities that align perfectly with your inner wealth. This is where old scarcity patterns dissolve, replaced by an expansive sense that resources are limitless and available. This is where subtle mastery develops. You become aware of energy patterns and consciously direct your emotional and mental states toward abundance. This is where your confidence radiates naturally, attracting people, offers, and solutions without effort or persuasion. This is where patience transforms into creative power, because the atmosphere sustains and multiplies itself once established. This is where timing bends effortlessly, as the environment you have imagined begins to synchronize events and encounters in perfect alignment. This is where clarity sharpens, revealing that each moment lived in wealth consciousness reinforces the next. This is where faith deepens, knowing that when the internal environment is abundant, the outer world cannot help but follow. This is where inspiration flows freely, providing new ideas, investments, and strategies to match your imagined wealth. This is where momentum accelerates, as repeated alignment turns your internal state into a self-sustaining magnet for income. This is where resistance weakens, because the atmosphere you inhabit leaves no room for doubt or lack. This is where mastery of presence becomes apparent. You are not chasing wealth, you are embodying it. This is where ordinary days feel extraordinary, infused with opportunities that echo your inner state. This is where the turning point solidifies. The creation of a wealth atmosphere ensures that income multiplies effortlessly, reflecting the life you already inhabit within. This is where you understand fully that your external reality is nothing more than the natural extension of the inner environment you have chosen. Think of the moment when appreciation transforms from a polite gesture into a creative force, a powerful signal that multiplies every financial blessing already present and yet to come. This is where Neville Goddard's teaching illuminates the crucial role of gratitude in aligning consciousness with abundance, showing that acknowledging wealth internally expands it externally. This is where the turning point emerges, when you stop waiting to feel thankful after gaining and start feeling thankful first, allowing income and opportunities to follow naturally. This is where ordinary recognition becomes sacred, as every feeling of genuine appreciation impresses the subconscious and attracts matching experiences. This is where your inner energy shifts, radiating magnetism that draws not just money, but favorable conditions, collaborations, and timely insights. This is where the unseen law acts consistently, because gratitude confirms to your mind that abundance is already present, reinforcing its manifestation. This is where subtle mastery develops. You notice and amplify even small financial victories, compounding them into larger streams of wealth. This is where doubt diminishes, replaced by unwavering certainty rooted in the felt experience of plenty. This is where imagination and feeling merge, as you rehearse scenarios of prosperity with a heart full of thankfulness. This is where opportunities begin to appear effortlessly, because the energy of gratitude signals readiness to receive. This is where resistance dissolves, as the act of appreciation leaves no space for fear or lack. This is where consistency becomes effortless, creating a feedback loop between internal acknowledgement and external increase. This is where your consciousness tunes to the frequency of wealth, making each imagined success feel tangible and immediate. This is where momentum grows, as gratitude amplifies the invisible forces that shape circumstances and attract income. This is where timing becomes aligned, as synchronicities and chance encounters manifest in accordance with your thankful state. This is where patience is energized, for you understand that every inner act of appreciation has already set the wheels of manifestation in motion. This is where identity deepens. You begin to see yourself as inherently wealthy, capable, and deserving. This is where miracles appear ordinary, because the law of gratitude ensures that abundance flows wherever attention is truly given. This is where the turning point solidifies. The simple, sustained practice of gratitude multiplies income by transforming perception into active creation. This is where you finally realize that wealth is less about accumulation and more about cultivating a heart that constantly reflects and amplifies the abundance already present. Suppose you discover that living as though your financial goals are already achieved is not pretend, but the fastest path to manifesting them in reality, where the outer world cannot resist the inner certainty you project. This is where Neville Goddard's principle of acting as if becomes a catalyst, bridging imagination and tangible wealth through the seamless integration of behavior and belief. This is where the turning point emerges, when your thoughts, feelings, and actions align with the identity of the person who already enjoys multiplied income. This is where subtle mastery develops, because each deliberate act of as if carries the energetic signature of the fulfilled state, imprinting it onto the subconscious. This is where momentum accelerates. Your choices, decisions, and interactions begin reflecting the confidence and resourcefulness of someone already prosperous. This is where old patterns of hesitation dissolve, replaced by bold, inspired action that mirrors your imagined success. This is where the invisible law responds, orchestrating opportunities, partnerships, and financial flows that match the state you have assumed. This is where inner conviction transforms ordinary behavior into magnetic influence, drawing recognition, trust, and reward. This is where clarity sharpens. You understand that external appearances are merely a reflection of inner alignment, and that acting as if is a direct signal to the universe. This is where patience becomes empowered, because the mind, body, and soul are synchronized with the desired outcome before it physically manifests. This is where resistance weakens, as embodying the fulfilled self eliminates doubt and indecision from every choice. This is where creative energy flows effortlessly, producing solutions and strategies aligned with the reality you are inhabiting internally. This is where identity solidifies. Each action reinforces the belief that you are inherently capable, resourceful, and wealthy. This is where timing bends, as inspired action meets circumstances prepared to respond favorably. This is where opportunities seem to appear spontaneously, because your assumed state radiates readiness and authority. This is where the feeling of fulfillment permeates every interaction, influencing people and situations to mirror your inner reality. This is where consistency becomes natural, sustaining the magnetic field that multiplies income without conscious strain. This is where miracles appear ordinary, as the outer world aligns seamlessly with the inner assumption. This is where the turning point crystallizes. The act of living as if transforms imagination into lived experience, accelerating financial results with precision. This is where mastery manifests fully, proving that embodying wealth internally produces wealth externally in exact proportion. Ask yourself what happens when wealth is no longer sporadic, but a consistent, flowing reality maintained through deliberate daily inner practice, where your consciousness becomes a perpetual magnet for income. This is where Neville Goddard's teaching on disciplined mental rehearsal reveals that consistent engagement with your assumed state sustains and amplifies abundance. This is where the turning point emerges, when imagination and feeling are exercised every day, reinforcing the identity of financial mastery and multiplying income naturally. This is where subtle mastery develops, because repeated mental discipline strengthens the subconscious, making prosperity an automatic reflection of your inner state. This is where ordinary routines transform into powerful rituals, as visualizations, gratitude, and as-if enactments become the fuel for your financial growth. This is where momentum accumulates, each daily practice building upon the last, compounding the unseen energies that generate income. This is where doubt weakens, because the constant inner rehearsal creates certainty that manifests outwardly. This is where clarity sharpens. You recognize that external fluctuations cannot disturb the reality you continuously assume internally. This is where patience is energized, knowing that each mental rehearsal plants seeds that blossom in perfect timing. This is where alignment deepens. Your thoughts, feelings, and actions operate in seamless harmony with the wealth you intend to experience. This is where creative opportunities begin to appear effortlessly, guided by a subconscious conditioned for abundance. This is where faith solidifies, as repeated inner practice proves that consistent assumption produces inevitable results. This is where old scarcity habits dissolve, replaced by the automatic expectation of prosperity. This is where the turning point sharpens, because sustaining inner practice converts imagination into lived experience, leaving no gap for doubt or fear. This is where energy radiates in every interaction, naturally attracting income, clients, and collaborations that match your assumed state. This is where consistency becomes effortless, and wealth multiplies without strain or external persuasion. This is where miracles feel ordinary, as opportunities align seamlessly with the practice of internal assumption. This is where mastery manifests fully, because abundance is no longer occasional but habitual, flowing continuously from your inner discipline. This is where the invisible law operates without interruption, as sustained practice ensures that the subconscious never forgets the reality you inhabit. This is where you finally understand that daily inner practice is the secret to not just achieving wealth, but sustaining and multiplying it indefinitely. Envision a life where there are no limits to the income you can attract, where every financial goal, dream, or aspiration is only the beginning of what your consciousness can create. This is where Neville Goddard's teaching on infinite possibilities reveals that your imagination is the ultimate source of wealth, unconstrained by circumstance, time, or perceived limitations. This is where the turning point emerges, when you stop measuring success by external standards and begin exploring the endless landscapes of what can be assumed and felt as real. This is where subtle mastery deepens, as you realize that every new income stream, investment, or opportunity is a reflection of the infinite creative potential within you. This is where faith, feeling, and imagination converge, producing a cascade of abundance that multiplies without ceiling or interruption. This is where old beliefs of limitation dissolve, replaced by the exhilarating understanding that money, opportunity, and success expand as far as your mind dares to imagine. This is where the invisible law operates in full spectrum, translating every inner assumption into an exact outer reflection. This is where identity and vision fuse. You are no longer the person waiting for opportunity, but the infinite creator whose wealth knows no bounds. This is where consistency solidifies, as each imaginative act, inner conversation, and as-if enactment compounds the possibility of higher income. This is where momentum becomes unstoppable, because each new manifestation reinforces the inner state that generates even more. This is where clarity sharpens. You recognize that limitation exists only in thought, and abundance exists only as far as imagination is willing to stretch. This is where energy radiates freely, drawing people, ideas, and circumstances that mirror your infinite creative authority. This is where persistence feels effortless, because the law of assumption requires only sustained internal reality, not external struggle. This is where miracles unfold naturally as synchronicities, opportunities, and financial growth accelerate in perfect alignment with your inner state. This is where the turning point crystallizes. Your mind becomes a laboratory of wealth, and income expands in direct proportion to the creativity, faith, and feeling you bring. This is where mastery manifests fully. You are no longer subject to limits, timing, or chance. You are the conscious designer of limitless prosperity. This is where imagination becomes the infinite engine of creation, and every desire conceived and felt is a seed for multiplied income. This is where the cycle of abundance repeats eternally, as every manifestation reinforces the limitless field of possibility. This is where you finally understand the ultimate promise, that income has no ceiling, wealth has no boundary, and your imagination is the key to infinite expansion, allowing you to live in a constant state of creation, fulfillment, and financial mastery.